We're going to move to our first speaker on the panel this morning. Um, we've got Andrew Petersen, as I said, the CEO of Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. Andrew has been working in this role since 2011, and prior to that, Andrew had a legal and policy career advising on matters relating to environmental risk, law, and policy, including climate change, and as a thought leader and advisor on the business of sustainability in Australia and overseas as a partner of PricewaterhouseCoopers. So, we've asked Andrew to present on understanding the global and domestic drivers of environmental investment. So, thanks so much for joining us today, Andrew. If you're having trouble, and
No,
you've got
Rachel,
got it.
thank you for that.
Perfect.
It's a case of coming back from leave and forgetting where the unmute button was on Zoom. I knew it was there. I just wasn't entirely sure. Thank you
There
so
we
much
go.
for the opportunity to chat with you all this morning. And in coming to you, I am on the land of the Camaragal people, which, for those of you who are not aware, is actually a suburb of Sydney, Camaray. And so I'm delighted to join with you in this conversation about a very, very hot topic, having come from a conversation with a lot of senior business leaders in Switzerland. Somebody's got to do it over the last couple of weeks around climate and nature. And nature seems to be the new climate, if I can paraphrase it poorly for you to give context to the topic that I've been asked to talk about. In answering the question about the role and relevance, and at that rate, the rate of expansion of this thing called the environmental market, it's interesting to observe that it's gone from zero to hero as a conversation starter amongst business, particularly in such a short period of time, and particularly during what I call the equivalent of the Marvel blip, which, if you follow Marvel superhuman comics, you will know lasted for 5 years, whereas ours only lasted for 2, which was COVID. But it was a very interesting moment in time where the contemplation by business around its role and relevance in the broader ESG narrative brought back the conversation about proper pricing natural resources rather than just pricing them for the purposes of commodity market exploitation, whether that was coal, iron ore, or now the sexy new kid on the block, lithium. And with that, you've got this deeper conversation happening within companies right across the globe, whether they see it as an obligation or a potential compliance matter that they have to factor in. But more importantly, I think they're looking at it as an area of ambition in looking at the difference in which their own business model will play. Now, I won't be Pollyanna by saying that that has come to a point where business, particularly in all sectors, has gone and understood the role and relevance of environmental markets, largely because in terms of their ubiquity, whether they are local, regional, national, or global for that matter, really is still a work in progress. But the simple fact that business itself is being involved in the conversation, and my proof point around that is in 2022, during the development of and then the announcement around the Global Biodiversity Framework under the Montreal Kunming Framework. And with that, it was business that was in the room for a very large part of the time, talking about its importance under Target 15 and the role of the private sector. And in a number of cases saying that they wanted to be caught within the overall framework so that they then had a role to play in issues like mobilisation, the issues of targets also within that framework. And I think that's because business has felt, and I'm again not being Pollyanna, I don't think it's all business, and certainly the 51,000 publicly listed companies in the world aren't all of one voice, but there was a sense that they had got it wrong with climate and they needed to be involved in this conversation around nature because there were more sectors that were going to be involved in that challenge. And the reason being is that in the case of an environmental market creation on nature, you're talking much more about localized impacts rather than necessarily the global manifestation of climate. a tonne of carbon is a tonne of carbon, whereas the impact in relation to localised development of environmental markets, particularly on nature and or biodiversity more specifically, does have local impact. And so I think that there was an interesting moment in time from that COP that we're now seeing companies actually manifest themselves. Of course, we had the work of the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. But remember, that came as a result of the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is now embraced within the international framework of the International Sustainability Standards Board. So when I look at the question of, well, what is the roadmap in relation to environmental markets, I think there are three things. The first being ambition, the second being, well, what's the action being taken, and the third being, well, what's the accountability associated with that that's going to show, drive value, particularly for business. I'm focused on business, conscious that this is not just necessarily a business conversation, but I wanted to give you that insight. And so with that, you have seen a huge amount of work done very, very quickly in relation to the issue of accountability, which from most business perspective is seen as a proxy around compliance. But the brutal reality is the TNFD and its manifestation into reporting frameworks under the International Standards, Sustainability Standards Board, or for that matter, any manifestation in Australian obligations under any new accounting or audit standards is yet to happen. And that's not going to happen for years. And largely because nobody knows how to account for it yet. The building blocks and the identifications that have been given within the TNFD and the work of Tony Goldner and his team have been incredibly helpful for business to start getting into the conversation about, well, not just what is the impact of business, but what increasingly is the dependency that business has upon nature to be able to create the value that it creates for markets. And for that matter, how it attracts investors. The really interesting area, though, is the investor when it comes to the issue of accountability, because in much the same way as the conversation on Scope 3 emissions, you have this conversation about, so has the investor sector actually missed, has the finance sector actually missed a key area of risk that it needs to start thinking about more deeply? And I think that's where the driver of environmental markets is starting to manifest itself in a more concentrated fashion. In Australia, for example, that conversation in large part is happening within the work of the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative, but not exclusively. And that's going to be an interesting output when we see, I think what the expectation is, we're going to see some form of announcement around the strategy, or at least thoughts around the taxonomy coming through later this year. Not necessarily focused on nature, but you can see the link that's going to occur as a result of that. When we come to the work that needs to be done on accountability by business, whether that's as a preparer or as a user in relation to that, because it will reveal data, and that data will then help inform a market. And that's where the environmental markets come from. In terms of ambition, it's hard to say at this stage, at least in Australia, particularly after the last 18 hours, that our government necessarily sees that it's really that important to put some sort of high ambition in relation to securing our natural assets. And whilst unfortunate, I think the reality is that at least the announcement of a nature positive framework that's going to be applied to the policy work that's being done to respond to the global biodiversity framework at least gives, from a business perspective and the constituency I represent, that opportunity of putting into that mix, well, what does a market reveal as a result of the work that we're going to be doing in the strategies that you want as a country to deploy to respond to the policy framework under the GBF? Again, that will be an opportunity, I think, for business, not just in the usual suspects, being mining, to a certain extent, property and development, and also finance, but you'll also see other sectors. And the one that jumped out at me, particularly in the last couple of weeks overseas, is the consumer sector. It is very focused on the way in which it draws down on nature. And there will come a very short period of time in the not too distant future where the consumer will start to understand that in a very real sense and start asking the question, why am I buying this if I'm harming nature? And that's a real social license to operate risk for the consumer sector. Will it happen here? Not so sure. But as with all things in Australia, we tend to take 2 to 5 years to pick up on anything that comes from overseas. It's more than likely that we're going to see that conversation emerge, just as we saw that in relation to climate change emerge. So in terms of ambition, you've already got, in one sense, the North Star, which is the Global Biodiversity Framework. It has a conversation about the role of environmental markets that I think will take some good few years to play out as to what it looks like. And then you've got the issue of action itself. And this is the challenging thing at the moment about, does business play a role in relation to scale and speed? In other words, plays an important role in developing the methodologies and the reporting frameworks and the standards architecture that needs to be done in relation to reporting on the environment that helps then the market and respond for then financing restoration work, or more broadly, business models that are responding to a new form of nature improvement as revealed by the Nature Repair Market Bill, or do they still do the work that they've been doing over time? So in other words, we're dealing with very much a white male manifestation of, can I walk and chew gum at the same time? And I think the reality is that business has gone, I'm not sure where this is going. I think I need to take time out to understand and build the models, particularly if I learn something from climate that I can use for nature. And I think that has been my observation thus far, that rather than talking about markets and the manifestation of revealing value through some sort of pricing mechanism or valuation mechanism, explicit and extant and being used for the purpose of then investing in it, you're seeing a lot of work that then says, well, could this be invested in if it's done in this way? And I think for Australia, that's going to be in the agriculture sector. Just looking at the work of Farming of the Future, the work of the Malone Institute and the Biodiversity Council, for example, you see a lot of thinking around how do you bring new thought to value within the food and agriculture sector, and largely because it's a sector that's not covered under climate change policy thus far in this country, and therefore the way in which you could have nature respond in the same way, because it'll bring up the issue of climate, you have the opportunity of manifesting itself. Now, will that happen under the Nature Repair Market Bill? Who knows? We're all eagerly waiting for our invitation to go to the Global Nature Positive Summit in October. And that, I think, is a call for action around what the investment, both corporate and public sector, is going to be to enliven the opportunity for that particular market, which I don't think is going to be what a lot of people expect it to be, which is this great saviour in relation to nature restoration in this country. I don't think that's the reality of it at all. But I do think it's going to be one of these opportunities to look at how you properly value, not just price, but value nature restoration, and therefore bring some more value back into natural assets in this country. Now, that only comes as a result of a number of factors, and not the least of which is monitoring, reporting and verification. And all of that has to only occur if there's data, and the data has to be good quality. There is that data there. We know that to be the case. The question is, has it been captured? Is it available from the purpose of, from the point of view of democratisation of information, particularly in relation to Australia's natural assets, as opposed to being held by the private sector? So the role, I think, of the State of the Environment report has to become far more sophisticated in relation to the way in which it reveals value of which you can invest in, rather than having some other extant structure, some framework that is going to do it. We've been collecting data in relation to natural assets for some considerable time. We don't have a proper framework to do it. The EIA, the Environment Information Australia, is going to be one of those key tools that will be an enabler for the market to be revealed. Conscious of time, I think I might stop there and hand back to Rachel, and thank you for the opportunity of sharing those thoughts with you.
Oh, thank you.